Good morning.
I'm going to be hiding myself today because I feel like garbage. So, you know.
No. Yeah, do whatever y'all need to do. I think more and more people are feeling that way because more and more of my classes, no one has their cameras on. All right, so I'm going to give it just a minute to see if anybody else signs on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And actually, let me see if Zoom will send a file. I also emailed this to y'all just a few minutes ago. But hey, it actually said, okay, cool. So you have it in your email, but then you also have it in the chat. So, I'm gonna give it just another minute, but I think pretty much everyone's here that's gonna be here. So go ahead and open this case, this little vignette that I sent in the email and that I also just put in the chat. And just take a few minutes to read it over. And then we will talk about the differences in side A and side B. I'm off mute for anyone who is just getting in. There we go. Now you guys can see me. We are reading over the case study I emailed to you, and we will chat about it in probably 30 seconds or so when I finish taking attendance here. Okie dokie. So I am now screen sharing the case so that you all have it for reference. What are the differences that you see between A and B?
Well, in A, the dad kind of doesn't really listen to his son that well like he did in B. I think B, he just let the son like talk through his emotions instead of really like putting him down for what he did.
Yeah. What else did people notice?
In the first one, the father is almost accusing him, like, well, you did this with your brother, you always do something for people to be aggressive towards you, so you must have done something. So the son basically closes up and doesn't say anything. On the other one, he just facilitates, basically he's just repeating what the son says, like, I'm angry, oh wow, you're angry, like, and that way the son keeps talking because he doesn't feel judged.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Very good summary.
I was gonna say, like, in A, like, just because you're doing like kind of the blaming, are you sure, makes somebody defensive, and once you get defensive, communication is not easy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So what is the dad actually doing in B? How is he responding?
He's doing like active listening, kind of like guiding his thoughts a little.
Yeah. Is he making his own points? Is he interjecting opinions?
No, I think he's just letting his son get through all of the emotions he needs to get through for this situation and kind of just guiding that without putting his own opinion in it.
Yeah. I think you all are really spot on this morning. I can tell you've probably done your reading, which is great. Yeah. So essentially, B here is what a humanistic or client-centered or person-centered therapist would do. Those terms are interchangeable, and you'll hear all of them used for essentially the therapeutic technique that Rogers came up with. So you're just sort of reflecting what the person says. You're not guiding them as much, right, as like a analyst or even some of the more modern therapies might. And so, as you all pointed out, the son engages more, and they get to a better point. The father's not accusing the son. Any other reactions to this while I blow my nose?
His son probably, when he doesn't feel on the defensive, he feels like safer to open up to his dad and work through his problems. And the fact that he's talking to him implies that he needs to do this, like talk through it and find the root of the problem in a way to figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. So in the second scenario, his dad is giving him the opportunity to do that, right? Whereas in the first scenario, that really wasn't the case. Yeah, I think you all are really getting it. You're really spot on. And so this is a major difference for Rogers' type of therapy. All right, that's not gonna work. I was like, maybe I could just push my chair in. No. All right, we'll roll it out of the way. La, 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 la. Then I'll move this over here. And I think when I installed my ring light, I adjusted my camera. So let me do that. Yeah, now you can see me. The other day in the intro psych, it was like here if I stood this close to the computer. So helpful if you can see my face. So yeah, we are now going to start talking, and let me stop share real quick so that I can get into the PowerPoint. So now we're going to start talking about person-centered, or again, client-centered, humanistic, whatever you want to call it, therapy and theory of personality. And I think that vignette is just such a nice way to open up and look at, like, what is this actually like? What would it be like to be interacting with someone who is doing this? Alrighty, and I'm just going to pull down the chat in case anyone has any questions. Awesome. Alrighty. So the humanistic approach is fundamentally different from psychoanalysis. The psychoanalysis approach is really analyst-centered. The analyst is seen as this like blank screen to project onto. The analyst is the expert. The analyst is the one who's going to give you interpretations, right, after listening to you. This approach is person-centered. So it focuses on the client and that the client has the knowledge and we just sort of need to guide them to get here. So this is a great quote related to this idea. To get a butterfly requires the proper circumstances and some patience and acceptance. So here we see a profoundly humanistic idea that it's about patience, it's about the person figuring things out for themselves. So the premise of humanistic psychology is that to understand a person, you must understand his or her unique view of reality. So the idea is that studying the mind from this perspective is fundamentally different. So it's about self-awareness. It's, from studying other objects, the mind is aware and knows it's being studied, right? We're humans. We have the ability to figure out when someone's analyzing us, right? And so it's sort of this metacognition, right? We're thinking about thinking, we're studying about studying, right? So the goal in humanistic psychology is to seek to understand awareness, but also free will, happiness, and the many related aspects of the mind. So seek to understand awareness, free will, happiness, and the many related aspects of the mind that are uniquely human and that give meaning to life. So these ideas, these concepts in the mind are uniquely human and they give meaning to life. Do people have free will? And if they do, what does this mean and how is it even possible? Freud didn't really think people had free will. Remember, that's one of the criticisms we talked about Freud, is that people didn't really like the idea that they're controlled by these things they don't know about, right? So Freud thought everything was controlled by these unconscious motives, forces, right? Humanists do believe that people have free will. So one of the important constructs that comes up as we talk about humanistic theory is phenomenology. So I thought I'd take a couple minutes to talk about what the heck that means. So it's one's conscious experience of the world. So everything we hear, feel, and think. And really our other senses. It's essentially everything we're conscious of. Okay, that's phenomenology, our conscious experience of the world. Now, it might not be everything that's happening around us, right? But it's what we're conscious of. And so these quotes are some really nice examples for phenomenology. So we do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. It is not the things themselves that trouble us, but our opinions of those things. And this is actually an idea that will play into a lot of the modern therapies we'll talk about as well. That in fact, it's not the world, but how we interpret the world that makes things problematic. So the idea is that phenomenology is at the center of humanity, and that it's psychologically more important than the world itself. So reality exists, but it has to be perceived to matter, is the idea here. Sort of the old, if the tree falls in the forest, and humanists would argue, like, it only matters if you hear it. So, okay, humanists believe in free will, What's the basis of it? Well, they talk about construal. And this is a person's particular experience of the world. So how you experience the world. And everyone's is different, right? Each one of you in this class right now have a different construal of, the experience of the class, right? Maybe your tech isn't working that well. Maybe my voice sounds different to some of you versus others, right? Maybe you're distracted by other things going on, and you're also bringing things you've learned before as you learn this lecture. Yes, Debbie, I like your take on it. So we can't control what goes on around us, but we control how we react to it. Exactly. That's a very humanistic idea. So our free will is partially how we react to things, what our construal of things are. So this forms the basis of how you live your life, right? How you're going to react to things. And free will is achieved by choosing your construal. So you choose how you're going to see the world and how you're going to see everyone around you. So it forms the basis of how you live your life. It'll determine which goals you set, how you perceive obstacles, and how you perceive opportunities in your life. And so the biggest name, and I've already sort of name dropped him. It's kind of like name dropping psychologists. The biggest name in humanistic psychology is Carl Rogers. And so he was alive from 1902 to 1987. He is American. And again, his approach is called person-centered or client-centered. Some really interesting trivia about him, especially during Nobel Week. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for work on national intergroup conflict in South Africa and North Ireland. And there was a study looking at citations and recognition of psychologists in 2002. And he was considered the 6th most eminent psychologist of the 20th century and second only to Freud among clinicians. Although, as we read at the beginning of the semester, those lists can be sort of like, right? But it does show that his legacy is appreciated, right? So one of the main tenets of this client-centered approach, as Rogers presented it, is self-actualizing. And for Rogers, this is a verb. Okay, some of the other humanistic theorists will talk about this is like a destination you're trying to get to. For Rogers, this was a process you went through. Okay? So people have one basic tendency and striving to actualize, maintain, and enhance their own experience. What a cool way to think about people, right? I mean, this has just totally flipped the script from a lot of what we've talked about already, right? Where it's all sort of like the id and everybody's conflicting and it's just like, no, people, like, all things being equal, they're gonna just try to be better people. It's kind of a cool tenet, right? So Rogers believed that life is growth and development until you took your last breath. You were always getting better, growing, changing. Self-actualizing is a key process of life and of finding oneself. So the process of engaging with life is critical. And so for this reason, Rogers would have never used the word actualization. It was too passive. To him, this was an active process for people. So actualization or actualizing is the need to maintain and enhance life. And for Rogers, the goal of all of our existence was to satisfy this need to maintain and enhance our lives. And this is not easy, right? It's a great concept, right? It makes us feel good and warm inside, right? But it's not easy to, like, in the face of, say, everything going on in 2020, right? Be like, yeah, I'm going to keep being the best person I can be, right? It's difficult. The process of good life is not for the faint-hearted. It requires stretching and growing. To be oneself is at times scary as hell. But you can't really have courage without fear. So Rogers really believed everyone had the potential within themselves to engage in this process of self-actualizing. So some other related concepts here that he tied into this idea of self-actualizing was organismic actualization tendency. And yes, that is organismic, not orgasmic. We're out of Freud, so no more Freudian slips, hopefully. Knock on wood. So the organismic actualization tendency is within every organism to grow and develop as to fulfill their potential. So it's essentially the tendency to engage in self-actualizing. And I think it's so interesting that he calls it organismic, and he's saying it's not just people, right? It's all creatures, essentially. Every living thing. Humans are inclined to maximize this full potential. And this is almost like mystical, spiritual. You can almost think of it as the soul, or if you're a Star Wars fan, the Force, right? And it becomes self-actualizing. And the process of self-actualizing is congruent with this tendency, this organismic actualization tendency. And so you will sometimes see this abbreviated as OAT. So I just often just call it the OAT, just because it's easier than saying tendency, right? So the OAT. And then there's the organismic valuing process, the OVP. And here it is that people are born with the ability to evaluate each of the experiences they have to serve the OAT, to serve that actualization tendency. To be a person and interact with others must be learned via processes, but built into the organism existing before we develop a sense of self is this idea that you want to get better and you can evaluate experiences to see if they'll help you get better. So Rogers' idea was that if given a chance, infants and children will know what to do or can learn what to do in order to keep making themselves better people. So he thought that our job was to create circumstances where children can learn, right? So that as adults, it was kind of, it's not about like sitting down and teaching and memorize this. It's about creating the space and the experiences for children to be able to learn these things. And he called that potenting. So again, this is the process where we evaluate all of our experiences and decide which lead to actualization. And all of this is guided by the sense of who you are, or maybe who you ought to be. Congruence for Rogers was when the emergence of yourself, your concept of yourself, coincides with the out. Okay, so your self is lining up with your tendency to go towards actualizing. Your self is lining up with trying to be the best person you can be. So you're developing an identity consistent with the view of yourself, and you're using it to engage in that process of self-actualizing. Incongruence is where you don't have it together, where you're not living in a way that's consistent with the out, and for Rogers, this meant something had happened to disrupt that for you. So the opposite of the OVP, the organismic valuing process, is fear, insecurity, and mistrust. And these are created by conditions of worth. And so conditions of worth to Rogers were the root of any type of psychopathology, any type of personality problems, any type of development problems. It was these conditions of worth that came into play. So this is essentially a phenomenological contingency. The idea that we are expected and told to think in certain ways, and if we don't, there are consequences. So conditions of worth are communication from a person influencing your sense of self-worth. That I will be there for you if, right? Not just I'll be there for you, but they put a contingency on it. If. You must believe, behave, engage in certain things or certain ways. And if conditions of worth are not met, they imply you are not worthy of love, you are not worthy of attention, you are not worthy of respect. And they limit your freedom to act and think. With these, over time, fundamental aspects of who you are become foreign. If you're experiencing a lot of conditions of worth, it's like you're just trying to measure up to those, and you've lost the ability to tap into the OAT and the OVP and to like guide yourself, right, towards what's best for you. By trying to protect yourself, trying not to lose the love of those important to you, you lose yourself. It's really the opposite of the OVP. This idea, conditions of worth, says that kids are to be feared, mistrusted, and controlled, rather than, again, this idea that we just have to kind of set them up and they'll succeed. They have power. The conditions of worth have power over us because humans have a need for positive regard from others. Humans are pack animals, right? This is why I think dogs and we get along so well. It's because dogs are also pack animals. Humans want that connection. So it's part of attachment. It's part of being social creatures. And so we'll give up a lot of ourselves to try to meet these conditions of worth, right? And sort of lose ourselves in the process. So Rogers really emphasized the importance of what he called unconditional positive regard as a antidote to this. So he said that in therapy, you want to create something that's the antithesis of conditions of worth. And there's the antithesis of dependence. Rogers thought that doing so gives people the opportunity to come up with new self-concept and to get closer to the OAT and the OVP. It was his biggest goal in therapy, was to create this atmosphere of unconditional positive regard, where the client felt they could say something, say anything, do anything, what have you, and they would not lose Rogers' regard. Right? He would still care for them as their therapist. So it was his goal in therapy, but also his goal in teaching. Rogers was huge on sort of teaching the next generation to do this type of therapy. And also his goal of life, to be honest, his goal of being was unconditional positive regard. He wanted to give this to everyone. So what actually happens during client-centered therapy? The therapist tries to develop a genuine and caring relationship with the client and provides unconditional positive regard. And so a big part of this for Rogers was genuineness. This is a huge part of it. The client has to believe the therapist is genuine. The therapist has to be genuine. You can't fake this. Rogers said, people will know if you're like, oh, sure, I love you no matter what, right? People will figure it out. People are not dumb. Accurate empathy was also very important to him. So being empathetic, but being genuine in doing so, acknowledging when that's really horrible. And of course, I can't quite relate, right? But I want to, share with you that I feel for you. So a big goal in therapy is to help the client perceive their own thoughts and feelings without the therapist seeking to change them in any way. So I'm going to say that again, because it's, again, somewhat revolutionary to think about therapy in that way, right? So help the client perceive their own feelings and thoughts without the therapist seeking to change them in any way. To make the client feel appreciated no matter what he or she thinks, says, or does. And so once you've created this atmosphere in therapy, then your biggest goal as a client-centered therapist is to help the client become what he called a fully functioning person. So you're trying to get the client to be a fully functioning person. So you help them get in touch with the out. You work on trying to create congruence, to help them to create it between who they are being and who they have the potential to be. And again, really striving to help the client become this fully functioning person. So what is a fully functioning person to Rogers? So is someone who perceives the world accurately and without neurotic distortion and takes responsibility for their own choices. So they perceive the world accurately and without neurotic distortion and take responsibility for his or her own choices or their own choices. This is something that on Friday when we talk about existentialism will really play in with the ideas of existential theory and therapy. The idea that responsibility, you have to take responsibility for your own life in order to grow, is a big piece of that as well. So the fully functioning person can face the world without fear, self-doubt, or neurotic defenses. They are unafraid of their own feelings. Life is rich in emotion and self-discovery. And so these people are much more open to experience. So if you remember the big 5 that we talked about, they would score high on openness to experience. They're more spontaneous. They're not impulsive, but they're flexible. And they're creative. They're open to new possibilities or ideas. And freedom is a really important concept here. Freedom is having the capacity to using the information I have and moving beyond that. So I have the capacity to use the information I have and move beyond that. So someone who's a fully functioning person is in the process of self-actualizing. It does sound kind of great. Carly, so people do still do client-centered therapy, but typically now they'll integrate it with other types of therapy. So for example, I know that like our counselors in the counseling center use some client-centered aspects, but then also incorporate maybe some CBT or some psychoanalysis, depending on the client. There probably are people out there who just practice this, but yeah, it's great. Like personally, if I could like go back in history and choose anyone to be my therapist, I would choose Carl Rogers. And the really interesting thing is, and those of you who are in my clinical class in the spring will be familiar with this, is that Rogers, when you watch videos of him doing this therapy, some people find it frustrating because he doesn't guide the person. He, just sort of repeats back to them what they're saying, but they get to a really good place because of that. Yeah, I think, and like his manner is just amazing. Yeah, again, if I could go back in history, have anyone be my therapist, it would be Carl Rogers. Yeah. So yeah, you can definitely look for people. I think like if you look on Psychology Today, it is a magazine, but they have a database of therapists. You can actually like search for the type of modality they use and the type of disorders they treat. There we go. Couldn't think of the word. Okay, so that is Rogers. So he is, again, about everyone's just trying to be the best they can, and we need to, like, in therapy, essentially recreate that for them, recreate where they can feel comfortable doing that. Okay, another humanist here is Abraham Maslow, and I always have to explain this picture. So, when it's not COVID times, I volunteer with animal organizations. And when I lived in Augusta, Georgia, this kitty down here in the corner was up for adoption, and his name was Maslow. So I always just like sort of keep his memory by including him on this slide. So Maslow overlapped with Rogers. He was 1908 to 1970. He was also American, but he was coming at this from a totally different angle than Rogers, right? Rogers is all about everyone just trying to do their best and, you know, supporting them. And Maslow was fascinated with greatness. He wanted to be a great American. So he probably would not have been impressed that, you know, like one of his legacies is his cat's named after him, right? He developed the hierarchy of needs, which again, if you've taken like intro psych 102 here, right, you've probably learned this at some point in your life. So the basic assumption behind the hierarchy of needs is that the ultimate need or motive is to self-actualize, but you can only get there when you meet the needs underneath it. And the hierarchy needs is essentially a hierarchy of motivation. It's what we'll focus on. Hey, I think so too, Becky. I think it's a high honor. All right, so typically it's depicted as a pyramid like this. And I liked that this one had more of a 3D aspect to it. A lot of them are sort of two-dimensional, but the idea that this is like a fully fleshed out thing, I like. So the very bottom is the physiological needs. So these are requirements of the body and the nervous system. So food, air, water, sleep, sensory stimulation, and interestingly, Maslow put sex here. He thought sex was like a basic human need that you needed for physiological reasons. So interesting perspective. And then there are safety and security needs. So these are about assurance of order and predictability in the environment and removal of environmental threats. Okay, so it's like, first you've got to just like get your basic bodily needs met, then you've got to feel safe, right? And then there's belongingness and love needs, or love and belongingness. Love, friendship, affection from others, membership in groups, things along these lines. And then there are esteem needs. This is the recognition and appreciation from others of what one can do. And that leads to confidence in your own abilities and your independence. And then here again, this is the main difference between Rogers and Maslow. Is for Maslow, self-actualization is this place you're trying to get to on top of the pyramid. It's like a part of your existence that you can achieve if you are one of these great people, these very special people. It's being all you can be, realizing your own unique capabilities. And there are actually different levels to it, which we'll go over in a minute when we get to our other handout for today. So the idea is that each type of need must be reasonably satisfied before the next can be tackled. Thus, you have to feel physically safe before you can establish intimate relationships. And you must have some experience with intimacy before you can seek the esteem of others, and so forth. However, a lot of times we just memorize these, right? I mean, I did it for multiple classes throughout my undergrad career. Probably in grad school, we went back to it too. But in doing that, we lose sight of why he created these. So Maslow had the idea that basic needs are powerful. Then that once they're satisfied, you can then move up the hierarchy. And then you can turn to something he called B values. And here is where I'm going to share that handout. So I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint real quick here. And again, this is also in your email from today, but I'm going to send it to you in the chat as well. And then I'm going to screen share it here so that we're all on the same page. Alrighty. Let's see if I click on Zoom to screen share. There we go. Okay. And this is an old handout as well. These are my notes from when I was in this class as an undergrad. So, you know, excuse my handwriting and excuse me while I blow my nose real quick. Okay, so this is Maslow's pyramid, just sort of depicted as a flowchart instead. And so here you see the physiological needs, the safety needs, the belongingness and love needs, and the esteem needs. And these were called the basic needs by Maslow. And sometimes these were called the D values, and D was for deprivation. So like if you didn't have any of these, you were in a state of deprivation and you certainly couldn't accomplish what you wanted to. So a big part of safety is structured. Belongingness and love is really the need for close relationships. Esteem is about being in control, solving problems, and accomplishing things. Okay, and then we have this need for self-actualization. So the need to be what you can fully be. And so Maslow talked about this as needs to know. So truth-seeking needs, aesthetic needs, so beauty-seeking. And it wasn't like, you know, like influencers with their makeup channels. It was seeking out art and things along those lines. And then there were the B values or the being values. So I'm going to scroll down to our next page here. I hope you can read this. It says you don't need to memorize this table, so please don't. But this just gives you an idea of the B values. And then it has, you know, what happens if you, you know, can't have these, can't work towards these, what are the types of pathology you might experience? So for example, for truth, the pathogenic deprivation is dishonesty. And so then you might have disbelief, mistrust, and cynicism. And again, you see things like goodness, beauty, unity, wholeness, dichotomy, transcendence. So he thought that a pathogenic deprivation was black-white dichotomies, forced choices, either or thinking. He said life isn't that simple, right? Thinking about aliveness, uniqueness. So seeing sameness or uniformity as problematic. Again, that's another thing that on Friday we'll talk about, is common in existential theory as well. Perfection. So, you know, part of that is necessity. Completion, finality, justice. So he said, you know, then your flip side is injustice, and you have insecurity, anger, cynicism, and mistrust. Simplicity. You know, he said we don't need to be overly complex, even though we have to move past black and white thinking. There's no need to like try to explain things in the most complicated way possible. So he would have been a huge fan of Freud, obviously. No, definitely not. Richness, totality, effortlessness, playfulness. So again, like Freud, he really emphasized the importance of humor. And then self-sufficiency and meaningfulness. And so he said, you know, if you have meaninglessness, then you have despair and senselessness of life. And so Maslow came up with characteristics of self-actualized people that were later translated into dimensions of psychological well-being by Riff. So a more efficient perception of reality where you can detect what's fake or dishonest, acceptance of the self, spontaneous, simple, and natural, problem-centered rather than self-centered. You have like a sense of mission in life. Interestingly, he also said that these people have a need for privacy and solitude, which I always kind of thought was interesting. That's okay, Ramina. Again, I video these, so it'll be up on YouTube sometime today. And then sympathetic identification with others, mystic or peak experiences. We'll talk about that on Friday as well. Existentialists talk about this as a concept called flow. Deep and profound interpersonal relations. So like you need privacy and solitude, but you also need deep interpersonal relations. That you essentially are someone who sees all people as equal, able to distinguish means from ends, good from evil, philosophical with a sense of humor, creative, able to transcend the boundaries of their own culture. There are some possible imperfections he acknowledged, right? They can appear ruthless or shocking or absent-minded, and they can still experience a lot of the same things we experience. So the B values, these being values, were meta motivation. So you said, again, you've got to meet these basic needs, and then once you've met those, you can get to these meta needs. So it's expression of the self and these B values rather than reducing tension or satisfying a deprivation. It can be really ambiguous and frightening, but also exhilarating. And if you renounce it, it leads to guilt. So you're transcending those musts and shoulds that Horney talked about, right? You're transcending those dichotomies. And it's celebratory, which I kind of like. And I don't have it in this particular lecture. I think I showed it in my intro one. But Maslow did come up with like a list of people that he said were self-actualized, basically, like he decided. And it was people like Abraham Lincoln and things like that. So, okay, respect. It's sort of interesting to think about, like, why did he get to decide that, right? And I don't know if he ever declared himself self-actualized or not, to be honest. Alrighty, so I got one more slide here about the B values. So the B values, or the being values, are geared towards the attainment of fuller needs. So the basic needs are met, but it's just not enough. I want more. So again, these are the meta needs. They're above the basic needs. The B values are fundamental. They're the highest of human needs and simultaneously the deepest. So we like want them the most. The idea here is to be a human being. So what are you being? Not just a noun, a verb. What are you being? Being the things that represent higher experiences about doing what needs to be done. So through the B values, people express their humanity and celebrate it. To celebrate is to share in a greater joy and to participate in an eternal dilemma. All right, so we will stop there. And then on Friday, we will cover existentialism, which again has some things in common, but is not quite as optimistic as humanism. So I'll do my normal thing and hang around a couple minutes in case anyone has questions. And if not, I will see you all on Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Have a nice day.
So I don't know if you're familiar with like the gentle parenting. I guess it's kind of a trend of parenting going around, but they base it a lot off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and understanding that tantrums are based off of like basic needs first.
How interesting. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right?
Yeah, but it's really cool. Like it's on parenting TikTok. So
Oh, I didn't even know there was a parenting TikTok. There you go. This is what I get for being out of touch.
there's an everything TikTok.
Of
But
course there is. Just like there's an everything Twitter.
yeah, see you Friday.
All right, see you Friday.